righty. Well, we'll go ahead and get started here. I want to thank everybody for joining us for Story Stop Roanoke. This is event I've really been looking forward to. I think I'm going to get a lot out of it myself. The idea of this came from Chris. I'm sorry, I should have confirmed how to say your name.
Spisak.
Spisak, okay. And she came to me, I guess, back before Christmas and had this idea to do an event with herself and several other local writers talking about how you can take your own stories and turn them into written stories, or just use the whole concept of family stories to improve communication with your own family and really put them to work for you. Chris is a Roanoke native. She went to North Cross and she lives in Richmond now. And she's going to be talking specifically about the work in her book right now that is the Family Story Workbook. And she'll show us a copy of that. And what's really cool about this book is you can use it for just your own benefit. It's got great writing prompts in it that would be good to complete them and give them to, children, grandchildren, whomever you think would enjoy that. And then she's going to talk about how you can use it and create your own stories. She also has written other books. She's very much into communication and helping people write and to get better at it. I think she next week will, along with all of us, be celebrating National Grammar Day. We should have maybe set this for National Grammar Day.
That's true.
She's got a novel editing workbook, and as all of our dear people here know, that is a very important thing to do, is to edit your novel after you write it and have others help you edit it. And then Get a Grip on Grammar. That one I think would probably be just a lot of fun to read. I'm kind of a grammar nerd. So, well, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and she's going to introduce our panelists, and we will go from there. I will encourage you to put any questions you have in the chat function. And after we do some with the panelists, we'll come back and ask some questions. And we will wrap this up about 8 o'clock, but we'll allow plenty of time for questions, and we'll turn it over to Chris now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dolores. And book no further. This is a really special one for me because, as Dolores said, Roanoke's my hometown. I grew up in Roanoke, went to North Cross School the entire way through, and this third book of mine came out in November. And what do you do when a book comes out in the middle of a pandemic? So it's been a very funny little ride, but I have been on a national virtual book tour since November, and it's been wonderful virtually visiting Austin and Philadelphia and New York and Boulder, Colorado and Atlanta, and we've been all over, which has been an absolute joy. But this Story Stop Roanoke is not the end. I will not say it's the end of the trip, but it's kind of the end of the boom, 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 one after the other events. So what a time to end with Roanoke, Virginia, my hometown. That's just very special for me. So thank you all for being here. To give you a little bit of background, Dolores was wonderful with her introduction. I have been on a mission since as long as I can remember, to empower people through the usage of their words, through the usage of their stories. That's where my books came from. Get a Grip on Your Grammar came out in 2017. And it's been this wonderfully wild journey to go on this book. I think my favorite blurb about this book is someone called it an Elements of Style for the Twitter generation, where it's short, it's pithy, it's playful, it's full of pop culture. It was just picked up by HarperCollins India, so it's been really fun to just watch this book just kind of go and go and go and go. But after I wrote about communications for everyone, I knew I had more to say. Besides writing, I'm also a fiction editor, so I spend a lot of time with folks who have written that draft of their story. Maybe they're pitching to literary agents, maybe they want to indie publish this themselves, and you finish that first draft and then suddenly realize, I'm supposed to edit. What does that mean? What is this word revision that we're supposed to do? And I kept finding again and again that people didn't know what that meant. And I was teaching a lot of workshops on fiction revision, and that's where my second book came from. So I had the just general communications, I had the storytelling empowerment for the fiction writers, but a big belief of mine is that we're all storytellers. You don't have to be a quote unquote writer to be a storyteller. You know those storytellers around your own kitchen table, around bedtime stories for your kids, around those stories that are kind of passed down generation to generation just whenever your family gathers. And that was hitting me a lot after my first two books came out. And then, of course, COVID hit also, and maybe we weren't seeing our family members as much as we were hoping to see them. Maybe we had these family stories that we were worried about, because what if no one writes it down? Maybe you're somebody who's always wanted to write your life story, but you've never done it. Maybe you've always wanted to record that story of that grandparent or that uncle or that aunt, but you've never done it. So what do you do in that situation? So that's where the Family Story Workbook came from. It is truly a workbook with prompts taking you through section by section from generations past and all the things you could possibly dig up. There's a big section on your own life, diving into moments that maybe you haven't thought about for years, but these are the moments that shaped you into the person that you are today. So in this moment when maybe you're not going out and socializing as much as you could be in another moment in history or another moment of your life, maybe people need a project to examine how they've become who they are. There are lots of different sections and prompts. As you can tell, this is really prompt after prompt after prompt. And I've been loving how so many people have been taking this book on a journey with their own families during this time, whether people have been doing a Zoom call with multiple family members, giving everybody the exact same question, and then hashing out how maybe siblings remember an exact same moment in very different ways, how different generations remember that party from your childhood, but the parental vision of that party is very different from the kid version of that party. There are a lot of ways you can play with this. And I like to say that because people are so intimidated sometimes by that idea of being a writer and having the official history of the family written, don't worry about it. Just this is a moment to just jot down those stories in whatever capacity they are. And really in this era of Zoom and video recordings, why not take that audio or take that video recording of your family having the conversations prompted by this book, because that's a special memory. That is such a special moment that you can preserve of that conversation even. So anyhow, this is where this book came from, and I've been super excited to go on this journey with it. But again, when you're launching a book in the middle of pandemic, what do you do? Yes, you have virtual meetings that you can have, but you know what? I'm someone who's so passionate about the writers, and I'm also so passionate about the literary community of indie bookstores. Dolores, Book No Further, Roanoke has this amazing community around the indie bookstores, around the writing community. And so many places across the country have this little literary core. And so that's where I've been tapping into for my book tour, is just hopping around from bookstore to bookstore, from local storytellers to local storyteller to local storyteller. And that's why today I am very honored to have three guests with me. And I'm going to open it up to each of you just to say hello and introduce yourselves for a moment, because I'm sure you can introduce yourselves much better than me reading an incredibly bland bio, sitting here reading on paper, because that's never nearly as fun as you actually sharing your own voice and your own personality. So the fun thing about Zoom is we all have our Brady Bunch style screen, so you don't know what order I'm going to call you, because I'm just going to go in the order that I see you. But Angie, I will start with you. If you could say hello and say a little bit about what you write, the stories you tell.
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. I'm Angie Smyver. I live here in Roanoke, and I'm the author of 6 novels for young adults and middle grade. So that's teens and tweens. And I also have written some short stories and a whole bunch of nonfiction for kids. So that's my primary audience. My latest series is the Ghosts of Ordinary Objects series, which I've got here is Bones Gift, Lingering Echoes, and The Truce, which just came out last year during the pandemic. It was supposed to come out in May, didn't come out until August. And this is such a good fit with your passion, Chris, because this is about family stories. So back to you, Chris.
Fabulous. Thank you, Angie.
Yeah.
Christina, if you could say a little bit about yourself. I feel like the crowd knows y'all really well. I feel like I'm the outsider who doesn't actually live in Roanoke anymore, but go for it.
Hi, so I'm Christina Naifong. I am mostly a nonfiction writer. I write magazine stories and personal essays. If you are here in Roanoke, you're definitely familiar with the Roanoker magazine, and this is the issue that's out on the stands now. So if you are not a subscriber, you can pick one up. It's really a wonderful, as local journalism sort of pauses or is not as strong as it once was. This magazine really does a lovely job of telling the stories of Roanoke, and so I'm happy to write for them. I also have a newsletter, a monthly newsletter that I send out to subscribers called Nourishing Stories. It's probably hard to read, but in it, I write personal essays and include recipes for seasonal dishes, and then have links to my writing and other things that are interesting. I'm very involved in the local food scene, and I'm working on a middle grade novel, which would be my first attempt at fiction. And it's about two kids growing up on a farm, a family farm. So I am so excited to be here, Chris. And I really I just picked up the storybook, the family story workbook from Dolores yesterday. And the questions in it are so great. As someone who spends her life asking other people questions, I was like, she's got some really great questions in there.
Thank you very much. And it's exciting. I can't wait to hear more about your book as it's coming together. And Larry, if you could jump in at the end here.
Hello, thank you very much, Chris. I'm Larry Bechtel. I'm from Blacksburg, Virginia, up the mountain from Roanoke. And I am retired from Virginia Tech. I'm a sculptor and a writer. You can see a little figure behind me. That's Isaac, who's actually the protagonist of the trilogy that I have been writing. The first one was, some of you know this, A Partial Sun, which came out in 2019. And then this one, That Dazzling Sun, which came out during the pandemic. We all have these pandemic experiences. So both those books grew out of a sculpture that I did, a portrait bust of the protagonist a number of years ago. And the story just so stuck with me that I started to write it out well, first one novel, which became two, and then a trilogy. And behind me, you see the storyboard for the third one. And I'm at, I guess, about 2/3 of the way through, and I've paused it because I've got a sculpture project going. And sculpture and writing go together for me because when I'm working on a sculpture, a figure, I invest it with life by means of developing the figure's story. So I like the two of them a lot, working together like that. And when my children were growing up, one after another, I was telling stories for the Blacksburg New School. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's a parent-teacher cooperative. Every parent has a contract. And my contract was to tell a story. I mean, I got the good one. And that was, I did that every week. And some of those stories I actually recorded. So I've got 3 CDs of children, some children's stories, some adult stories. And I've got an additional group of stories which I hope to put together into a book. So I'm really happy to be here, and this is I love this subject. So look forward to our conversation.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And I love the idea of stories growing out of sculpture too. That's magical to me. My brain does not work in such ways as that. And that's awesome. I absolutely adore it. Well, when it comes to stories, we all have read history books. We have all gone to history classes, and maybe we have been falling asleep in such classes, and maybe we have been thinking that this is not relevant. This is a bunch of dates that we have to memorize. But when it comes to history, we all have our families have our own histories. Maybe we're not all in history books. Maybe we don't have the stories that necessarily changed the world, but we have a lot of stories that changed our worlds. And because we have all of these stories, this is such fodder for our imaginations. If you happen to be a creative writer using, I guess, what do they say, to write what you know? There's so much that you can pull out of your own living experience, your own family stories for your creative process. However, if you are not a writer, quote unquote, we all have these stories that are worth preserving from generation to generation, because we all preserve them in different ways, right? Sometimes we do write them down. Sometimes we tell them at those family gatherings. Sometimes we save them in unique ways. Sometimes our family stories are just held in the recipes that we share. Sometimes it's in the music that we sing to each other, from grandparents to child. There are so many ways we tell these stories. Excuse me. And before I kick off the storytelling of the night with our wonderful guest panel, I just want to tell one quick one of my own, in that when I was younger, I had the opportunity when I was in high school, it was actually through North Cross, to go to Europe for the very first time. Now, my grandparents on my mother's side were born in Europe. They're Ukrainian, and they came to this country after World War II, and they didn't speak English. They first came to Canada, and then came to the United States. But when they came to this side of the Atlantic, they did not speak any English. I knew this story. I know so many little tidbits about this. But a couple years ago, when my mother, who actually used to teach at North Cross, was cleaning out my grandparents' house, she came across this book. Okay. So she came across this book, and you can see it is duct taped together. This is the National Dictionary Self-Pronouncing Business English and this is the dictionary where my grandparents worked to understand the English language off of this dictionary. And as I said, when I was in high school, I had the wonderful opportunity to go to Europe for the first time. Didn't really think about this experience, but my mom, who knew I was obsessed with all things language, knew I would completely geek out over having the dictionary that taught my grandparents English. And as I was flipping through this, I found a note. Inside this note is a letter draft that my grandmother wrote to me before my first visit to Europe, where she was trying to explain to me about just how my eyes are going to be opened by going to a place that is not Roanoke, Virginia, because I grew up in Roanoke and this is where I spent my time. And this was my first eye-opening experience. And she was trying to capture this in a letter to me. And so what happened to this actual letter? This probably was a magical, wonderful letter. I have no clue what happened to that original letter. I don't even remember receiving that original letter from my grandmother. But I had this draft that was hidden in the dictionary that she was probably using to make sure she got all of her spelling and everything correct. That is a magical family story for me. And as I write, as I edit, I keep this duct taped together dictionary behind me at all times, because it kind of tells me where I come from. It's kind of what I'm up against and everything that we're going for. And it drives me. And we all have stories, no matter what direction they're coming from. We all have stories. And I wanted to open it up to our panel to see if they could tell us some of theirs, because this is the fun part of bookstore events. We're going to all kind of nuzzle in here in our own homes, desks, couches, beds, wherever everybody happens to be sitting tonight, and hear some stories. And Christina, if you wouldn't mind, I would love to start with you. I was wondering if you could tell us a story from a moment in your life that maybe shaped the kind of storyteller that you are.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to talk to you today about being a reporter. So it's not a terribly personal story, but it is a story that very much shaped the storyteller that I became. I was working for the Christian Science Monitor newspaper, a national newspaper based in Boston. And I was in their Atlanta bureau and was sent to Andersonville, Georgia, when a new museum was opening there to commemorate and collect information and display information about prisoners of war. I was sent down there as it was opening. There was sort of a grand opening type event, and there were scores of veterans and prisoners of war who were all there along with media and various important people. And so I had the opportunity not only to see the exhibits that were there in the museum and the place and the space, but to actually speak to the veterans and the prisoners of war. And I spent an entire afternoon hearing these just incredible, powerful stories. These terrible experiences that these mostly men had gone through, and the resilience and the hope and the what was important to them when they got out and when they got home, what they thought about while they were trapped in a foreign country, like perhaps not knowing what people were saying to them. And these stories were so moving and incredible and spoken. These men they weren't trying to use fancy words or literary devices. They were just simply telling me what had happened to them. And as I drove home from that event, I really felt the responsibility of being a journalist and a writer to try to relay the power and how moving each of these stories was. So I think that moment, I can, of all the hundreds of stories I've written and articles and features that I've written in my career, that is the one that I remember as the moment when the importance of stories, the power of stories, the responsibility given to me as a person who would be retelling these stories really sticks with me. And sort of like your Ukrainian dictionary, often when I'm feeling stuck or tired or, perhaps unmotivated, I remember, just how important stories are to connect us all and to as a way to share these moments that are so important to us.
Absolutely. See, that's a good story. Thank you for sharing. Larry, if I could jump over to you next. I know many of our families have certain people who are just the go-to storytellers, that we just know who they are. And I'm curious if you could speak to that for a moment. Who is an amazing storyteller, or maybe a couple of amazing storytellers in your family? And maybe what's one of their most famous stories, or what is it about the way that they tell a story that just captivates everyone?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Chris. I wish I had known you were going to bring up that dictionary, because I have got some books of my father's that he used first in college and then in teaching, filled with his liner notes and everything. And I was able to piece together a kind of a chronology of some things I was interested in and wrote about this. And so that does bring me to my father, and I'm wearing one of my father's ties this evening in his honor. So my dad, there are two storytellers that were very influential for me and for my siblings, and I know my sister Pam at least is here present in the audience, and that was my father and my grandfather. So my father was a professor of English, So he was professorial in his manner, even when he was out of the classroom. And he would often wear a tie, indeed, to the dinner table. My mother was the more chatty one, the more talkative of the two. But when my father began to straighten his silverware, we knew that he was about to dispense some words of wisdom, or occasionally tell an anecdote from his childhood in Philadelphia. And because we lived and had grown up in a suburb, a childhood in a city seemed rather exotic. So there was one story in particular that has really stuck with all of us, and it has to do with the dollar bill. So you can picture this. This would have been, I think, 1920, 1921, something like that. He was in grade school, probably sixth grade, something like this. So it's getting near the end of the year. The building is 3 stories high. It's hot. There's no air conditioning at that time, so all the windows are open. The teacher in the front of the room, this is him telling this story, is droning on and on. And my dad is sitting near the back of the room with the other boys, and this boy leans forward and says, "Oh, Paul, would you like to see my dollar bill?" Well, a dollar bill? Of course. So he reaches back very discreetly and takes hold of this thing and looks at it. It's a piece of paper, throws it out the window. And a few minutes later, this boy whispers the very same thing. "Would you like to see my dollar bill?" So Dad discreetly reaches down, takes that piece of paper, looks at it. It's a piece of paper, throws it out the window. So a few more minutes goes by, and the boy again leans forward. Paul, would you like to see my dollar bill?" So Dad discreetly takes hold of it. He doesn't even look at it. He just throws it out the window. And the boy says, Paul, you threw my dollar bill out the window. So my dad would always sit back and sort of grin and enjoy the response that he hoped he would get from these stories. The other influential story for me was my grandfather, who was a very different man. I don't think he ever finished high school. He left the farm at a young age and got a job on the railroad and worked his way up through the ranks over time, became a station master, retired as a telegrapher. Well, and that's when we got to know him. We would visit every summer, he and his wife. And the preamble to his stories was always the lighting of his pipe. And because we were raised in a Christian home, pipe, was kind of off limits. So it created this exotic atmosphere. And my brother and I would sit in our Adirondack chairs on either side of Grampy while he told, in particular, his deer hunting stories. So this is upstate New York in the upper reaches of the beautiful Susquehanna River, and you can sort of picture this. It's the dead of winter, it's bitter cold, the snows are deep, he's got his snowshoes on, he's got his gun in the crook of his arm, and he's tracking that big buck across the flat, as he called the valley around the Susquehanna. And because he's been watching this buck all fall long, he kind of knows where he's going. Watches that track go up toward the ridge, and he takes a shortcut on up in through the trees and finds a likely location, and there he parks himself waiting. And here comes this big buck up on the ridge, and that animal stops and sniffs, and he's got that scent. And Grampy seemed always to end these deer hunting stories in a kind of mantra or chant, and he would say, "And I laid the gun on him and touched it off, and down he went." So those were their two storytellers, and the two of them have been very influential.
That's wonderful. And I love the details that you're remembering in that of you knew your father's story was coming when he straightened the silverware. As a fiction editor, these are the type of details that I always tell my clients as they're writing, that we all have our little ticks. We all have our little mannerisms that are unique to ourselves. And your grandfather who always lit his pipe before telling a really good story. It's wonderful, the details, and those are good stories. That's very fun. I can imagine being a child sitting next to him hearing these stories. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And Angie, let's turn to you. I was wondering if you could talk about any moments in your own life that have inspired your own writing projects.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to tweak it just a little bit too.
Absolutely.
That not only a personal sort of memory, but also, like I mentioned, family stories inspired this trilogy. So I really had the seed for the main character for this story came from sort of a sense memory I had of, as a kid, we used to go down to the New River, grew up in Blacksburg, and mom would take us down to this spot down below where the tubing was, because it wasn't a tubing place back in the 70s, but down to a place along the Giles County part of the river where there was a place to go, picnicking and park your car and that kind of, and even camp, I think. But it was this great little place to swim. And I remember being that like 11 or 12-year-old girl in the, floating in the New River and, hearing, the cicadas and the crickets and the coal train sort of rattling along the river. And I remember being that kid that didn't want to, basically didn't want summer to end. And also being a little tomboy, I didn't want the, summer to end and to have to like face the, oh, well, you gotta like act like a little lady, wear the dresses and that kind of thing. This was the 70s in the South. So, but that sort of like seed of that, 11 or 12-year-old girl became the seed for my main character, Bone Phillips, in The Ghost of Ordinary Objects. Now that was the seed for the character, but I also was like, okay, I want to explore this place a little bit more along the river, which was where, my mom's family for generations came from. And in the New River Valley, from like the early 1900s to the 1950s, there were a lot of coal mines. And most of them, there's not even really a trace of them anymore. But my mom's family, my grandfather and his brothers, they worked in a mine called Big Vein, which is in McCoy. And I set the book, the series, the Ghost of Ordinary Objects series, in a coal mining village called Big Vein that's loosely inspired by McCoy and that era. And like I said it in 1942, it was kind of the height of the coal mining. It was also during the, the beginning of our involvement in World War II. So there's a time when there's a lot of changes going on. So perfect for middle grade fiction and, 11 or 12-year-old girl trying not to change. So really this was an exploration of both like my memory plus the family's memory. And I'm going to plug in here since all the dogs are starting to bark real quick. And they're not my dogs. Mine is barking too, but okay. And one thing I wanted to add was a lot of there wasn't a specific family story that inspired the stories I was writing in this series, but I was inspired in general by some memories of people who actually thought to write down their family stories. Because back in the 90s, I've got this, I don't know if you can see this, this is the coal mining memories from, it was oral histories that the Radford University did, of all the
Wow.
coal miners in the New River Valley, the ones, the surviving ones. And so that was 30 years ago. So there's not as many surviving ones. At the same time, a church did a much more informal thing. This was from it's called McCoy, Virginia Remembered. It was the Golden Years Club of this church down there, who just asked all the families to come up with their stories and some pictures and some cool artifacts. I mean, there's even some things like a page from a primer from 1892 in here.
How
So-
cool is that though?
I know. And looking through this, helped, get that era in my head a little bit. And, and I stole some names from here and there's some of the stories, but it just kind of gave me a feel for the time period that I wanted to write in and the kind of people. And so the short answer to your question is, yeah, the memory of swimming as a kid down there, plus like the combined collective memories of the people who grew up in that area, that's what inspired my latest books.
That's awesome.
yeah.
Now, and it's kind of funny that collective memory, I feel like is hitting so much of us right now, because I know I'm in Richmond. I know that the Virginia, used to be the Virginia Historical Society, and they just changed their name, and I'm going to completely butcher it, but it's something along the lines of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, I think. I know they were doing a big collection of 2020, 2021, tell the story of your COVID experience.
Yeah.
Tell the story of this, because there will be people 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 100 years from now, who are going to be curious what that moment was like, who aren't going to remember, who knows what. And I think those collective stories are so fascinating about, remember the first time you wore a mask in the past 12 months. Remember the first time you went to the grocery store and there was no toilet paper in the aisle. I mean, there's all of these little subtleties that we need to capture and remember for the sake of history. I like that collective idea too.
Well, and it's not those details that are going to be in the history books either. As you look on, if you're looking at the history of the 1940s, you don't know that, okay, well, this is how exactly the coupons work to get your gas, or, but somebody thought to wrote that down.
Exactly. And again, for the historians, for the fiction writers who want to go into historical fiction of a past era, like, let's help the cause and write some of this stuff down so we know what the buttons on the coat actually look like in this moment that were made of whatever they were made of. It's just fun to me. Yeah. And now, Dolores, I don't know if you're available to pop back onto camera. I'm going to open this up for everyone for these last couple of questions, but if Dolores is available, there you are. Hey. I would love to have you kind of start us off in this group discussion. Now, in my opinion, obviously, I think there's a whole lot of power in stories that are true, in stories that are fiction. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, why do stories call to you as a bookstore owner?
Well, I have been in love with stories as long as I can remember. I cannot remember a time when I didn't read, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of people. I come from a very, I'll just say, talkative family on both sides of my family that had wonderful stories to tell. My father's mother lived to be 102, and he was the youngest of 10 kids. She was born in 1890. And she could tell some wonderful stories. She had incredible memories, and she was very lucky that her cognizance and memory were just wonderful up until the moment she died, basically. And she told me a story one time on her 100th birthday. My background is journalism as well, and I just interviewed her like I would anybody for a feature story. And one of the stories that I remember most is, we talked about, well, where were you when you saw the first car? Where were you when you saw, using the telephone the first time? And I asked her, well, what do you remember about, airplanes? And she talked about where she had seen them and stuff. And she remembered things like, oh, we were at such and such house and we were making shirts and we were, all these details. And I said, just in passing, well, I guess you won't ride in one. You never will. You haven't ridden one, and I don't guess you will now. And she goes, oh, I rode one. And both my dad and my aunt just looked at her like, what are you talking about? They had never heard the story. And it must have been about the time my dad was very young, 2 or 3. Somebody landed a plane in the pasture near their home, and she got in and went for a ride. And that is a story that, had we not asked specifically, that she told us about. And I guess that knack of mine to want to do journalism and tell people's story has just rolled over into the bookstore, because people come in and you think you're going to talk about the stories of the books you're trying to interest them in or they're looking for, but it goes so often into their own stories. That I love this because when I was such and such age, I read this story and it's like this, or I've never read anything like this and I want to do that. And I think the stories just have such a life in them that, we all know that you can escape. I read a story, I guess it was 2 summers ago. I was reading a book called Labyrinth of Ice, and it was about the Greely expedition. And I'm sitting in my living room and I'm not facing the window. And I'm reading this thing, and it was a horrible experience for them. It was so cold. They were supposed to be picked up in a year, and it took 3 years to get them. And I finished and I turned around and I'm like, oh my God, the sun is out there. I was so cold and it was so dreary in my brain from reading this book. And that's what, it's what we try to bring to people in all kinds of books, and to get those stories in them, especially if they say, well, I don't read much. And then we're like, well, try this, try a short story. You can read it, you can read it tonight before you go to bed. So yeah, it's the storytelling is very important. I think I see in everybody's lives, and that's probably what brings them into bookstores.
Absolutely. And it's funny because I think we all have those books that changed us in some ways. I feel like Where the Red Fern Grows was the first book that made me cry. And I was like in 3rd or 4th grade. And I remember, like, let's see, Lois Lowry maybe was the first book that made me realize that just a book can completely blow your mind with the way it's making you think about the world in a whole new way. And I feel like getting those family stories, finding out about the grandmother who, of course, she would have never ridden on an airplane. And then, wait, this whole story just kind of blows your entire family's mind. I mean, there's secrets hiding in our families. And I don't just mean terrible ones. I feel like there are these little gems for everybody. And I was wondering, oh, go ahead, Larry.
I was thinking, well, you can sort of put things together by means of story too. So going back to my father, another incident that had really stuck with me when I was in early high school, I was just totally enraptured by the stories of Jack London. I read To Build a Fire in 7th grade when I was supposed to be doing something else. I don't know what it was, but I only remember that story. He was, to me, the greatest author who had ever lived. And I was at the dinner table one time, and Dad is at the end of the table, of course. And I think I went on about Jack London. I was reading White Fang, and he sort of cleared his throat and said, well, generally, they're not teaching Jack London except in high school. I felt totally crushed, even though I was only in high school, but I felt so belittled, this great icon of literature. So, but then as I mentioned, I had these books, and some from his teaching days, and going through these things. He taught high school originally in after he got out of school, he taught high school in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. And sort of putting things together, well, Jack London would have been alive then, and he was a major literary light. So he would have been well aware of Jack London. And being a high school teacher, he would have known the attraction of those books for high school students. And he was actually the one that gave me a copy of Call of the Wild. And he, my dad, was the one who actually got me started on Jack London, even though eventually he sort of diminished him. But I never saw that connection. I felt this connection with my father in doing a little bit of historical work by looking at his own teaching books and thinking about his career and where he would have been and so forth, and the connection with Jack London. So that was, for me, that was real interesting. And I felt, I don't know, I felt kind of at peace with him in a way.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Thank you. Christina, I'm wondering, when you're thinking about telling all of these stories and you're talking to so many people over the years, why do you think it's important for us not to find the power in our own stories, to find the power in kind of writing people's stories, but why do you think it's good for us to listen to other people's stories?
So to me, storytelling is the way that we connect. When someone shares their story, when I listen to someone's story, I the it's like a painting, Larry. The details, or a sculpture, the details of their lives start to fill in, right? And so that person is not just, a face with dark hair and brown eyes. Then that person has, a life, and all these details, and those are the ways that I connect with them. And so when we listen to people, we make these connections. We feel this empathy toward each other. We, as Dolores was saying about, we find ourselves in books, right? So when we listen and hear other people's stories, we find ourselves in them. We find those connections. I think, to me, stories, the power of stories is that connection.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Angie, anything to add? What is the power of story to you?
Well, was before this, I was just reading some of my students' narrative essays. This is what I teach college, and one of them had written a little note besides the story that he written, and it just said, "This was very therapeutic, and it was the hardest I've worked on a paper in college yet." And it was just this, he was telling his story of him and his wife and things that happened, and babies, but there were things that he was just dealing with as he was putting them on paper. So I think the power of the story for the writer is it's very therapeutic, and you get it, even if you're not a writer, if you can get it down and look at it, it gives you a little bit of distance too from your own story, and maybe a little empathy for yourself, because I think that's the connection. Like, as the listener to somebody else's story, you're looking, you're learning empathy through reading a story, and because you can put yourself in that person's place. But the person telling the story then is also, working out something, and maybe they need that perspective themselves and be able to empathize. I mean, not empathize, like sympathize with themselves, and be a little easier on them, on this experience they've been through.
I like that. Not just empathy with other human beings, but empathy and understanding oneself. I think that is completely true. Now, Dolores, I could go on and on. I have this whole list of questions, but I don't want to steal the evening, because I know there's also folks here who might have questions of your own, whether it is a matter of how does one go about starting such a project? How does one do that in this day and age? Questions about details of how do you set a scene well? How do you capture the emotions of a story well, or the characters of individuals in your family well? Questions for our wonderful panel of writers here with us. Questions for you, Dolores. So I will pause for a moment in case there are any questions, but if there aren't, I will keep going.
Okay, well, I just want to remind everybody, if you have some specific questions, just put them in the chat there and we will ask them. Or if you want to unmute yourself here, feel free to speak up and ask a question. I know I have one question of it's more of a process question of how you go about bringing all these pieces together. And I see people who are very hesitant to write things down, that they are concerned that they're not writers. And I had somebody tell me one time, I was working on a story for a magazine, I believe, and I was stuck on it. And I had a person who was a great writer and a good editor. She said to me, well, imagine you're sitting there telling your mother about what you did last night. I was reporting on an event. And she said, what would you tell her? And I'd say, well, so-and-so said this. And she goes, there you go, you're off, And it was such a good lesson for me to think about writing as a process of literally telling somebody the story. And I was wondering, what kind of tips do you have for people who want to not just hear these stories, but get them down on paper and not let their self-consciousness get in the way?
Absolutely. And that's such a good question, because you're right. The idea of filling in the lines forevermore, I mean, that can be an intimidating process. I know some people have notebooks that they keep next to this where they just kind of scribble down bullet points of ideas of, here are the major points that I want to make sure I speak to. One secret that I have found, and it's actually quite similar to what you've just said, Dolores, is we live in this age that can sometimes be intimidating, but it is quite amazing in terms of the technology that we have on our fingertips. There are a bunch of free apps that we have on our cell phone that are speech to text dictation. And a lot of them are free. One of my favorite ones is called Otter, O-T-T-E-R. And you can speak and tell a story to your phone or your cat or your dog or whoever it is, and it takes your speech, and not only does it record the audio, but it actually writes it out for you. So sometimes that physical telling of a story helps so much. It's funny because if you ever asked me 5 years ago if I would ever use dictation style software for my own writing, I would have laughed really hard and said, that's just not my thing. My brain does not work in that way. And I think that's still true for me for fiction. But in terms of nonfiction writing and my own personal storytelling and my own kind of writing that I use for my blog, for my podcast, for my teaching, I actually use dictation software a lot. The funny thing is, my second book, the Novel Editing Workbook, was written, the entire first draft was written via dictation, which is just really these apps on your phone where I teach editing workshops for fiction so frequently that I was writing it, but I kept coming up to blocks of how should I say that? And so I ended up pulling out my cell phone and recording myself explaining something, and all of a sudden the block was gone and I could just tell my story. I could just say it how I would say it rather than thinking about being literary in this moment. You can edit out anything. Editing is my favorite part of the process because you just need to spit out the stories. One of my favorite metaphors is that whole concept of you need to dump all the sand into the sandbox. And once all the sand is there, then you can build your castle. You got to just dump out the sand first. So whether it's audio, whether it's video, whether it's using technology to help the cause, whether you're explaining it to an animal, whether you are giving yourself a deadline, we all work so well off of meetings and calendars because this is how we organize our lives. Maybe you're somebody who works out at a certain time every day or once a week or whatever it happens to be. Maybe you're someone who schedules something meticulously for every single thing that you do professionally. Well, who's to say that at 7 p.m. every single night for just 15 minutes, you don't work on your life story? So just for 15 minutes every single day, you sit down and you write. And does it matter the punctuation? No. Does it matter what comes out? No. The only thing is 15 minutes every single day of writing stuff down. And you know what? Those 15 minutes every single day will add up tremendously, whether it's handwritten, whether it is typed in. You can fix it all later. It's just about dumping that sand all in, however you can do it. And with this family story workbook, I also know people who have scheduled weekly FaceTime calls with their family, and every week they tackle one question out of this book, and they record that, either FaceTime or Zoom or whatever it is, they record it. So then they have this memory of all of them sitting there cracking up or laughing or crying or getting angry or whatever it happens to be over that one story, or they're hashing through, what was that grandmother's dog's name again? And they're hashing it all out. But there's so many ways to get it out, but you just need to find a way that works for you. Any other advice from the panel? Larry?
Yes, I think I agree with that. I like to actually, if you don't mind being thought of as talking to yourself, taking a walk, either taking a walk or riding a bicycle, for me is a really good way of just unlimbering. The physical motion seems to assist with getting things out of my head. And to talk it aloud, just talk it to myself, is a really good start. And I do a lot of that before anything actually goes down on the page. So and the other thing is that a good thing to do is probably to start with what really draws you, like the core, the scene, not necessarily where it started. He was born and so, or he, just don't worry about any of that. Just start with the piece that you like the best and try to think that through, talk it out, write it down, and then kind of build it from there.
That's really good advice.
Yeah.
I'll jump in, sorry. Again, having looked at your book, one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was that you have these sections where some of it is, map out so-and-so's grandmother and so-and-so's 6 uncles. And to me, that's the part that's always like overwhelming. Like, I can't hold that in my head. To me, that isn't the story. But then you also have sections where you're like, talk about, this memory, or these prompts that ask you to talk about your family's memories or your personal memories. And so I would jump on that, Larry, and say, like, if you're a person who wants to tell a certain part of your family story, or there's certain kinds of stories that you like start with those. Like, don't get stuck on the, like, I can't get past the the so-and-so's like second cousin, like, because that just stops me every time. Just tell the story that, or answer the prompt that is appealing.
Yeah.
Well, and I would second that, because, when you're telling a story and if you don't know a part of it, a lot of times what I do is I just put ... or, come back to this part later. And just remember, you don't have to have everything perfect when you put it down, because you're going to, you're taking notes, you're going to rewrite things, you're going to rearrange things. So revision is your friend.
Exactly. And when it comes to things like this, if you just heard the word revision and started shaking a little bit because that sounds like they're red pens involved, oh my gosh.
No.
It's okay, because even if what you're writing down is just bullet pointed, like, I remember I remember this. My favorite prompt to give with so many of these is just starting out, I remember. And any of these things, I remember, and just spit out whatever it is you remember about that. And then when your pen stops moving, just go back to that phrase, I remember, and just go until you can't think of anything else. I remember, and then keep going with this. And I'm holding up the wrong book here, but one of the things I say in the beginning is, if you don't like any question here, this is not an assignment. Skip something if you don't like it. And Christina, you gave a great example, and it's cracking me up because my very first question here is about a semblance of a family tree. And the first version of this that went out to my editor did not have that question. And it was just very funny because I am equally intimidated by okay, so your parents, your grandparents, how far can you extend the family tree? It's like, I feel like it's an elementary school project that always intimidated me. Sometimes you can't fill in all the pieces. But you know what? That's okay. If you don't like that question, skip that question. You're not getting judged for this. This can be something you hold in a box under your bed just for you. This can be something you pass down and spread around. You can do whatever you want. And that's the fun thing of a workbook where it's not a school assignment. You can do whatever you want. You can answer these in poems. If that's where your heart is, answer this in poetry, answer this in stories. Maybe just the way your brain works, this will inspire you to write fiction based on historical events from your own life. You can go anywhere. There are no rules. How fun is that?
Yeah, I think it's also a place that the storytelling, well, anyway, I've used it myself for tackling parts of my life that I wanted for sure to remember and that were meaningful in a special kind of way. And the careful writing it out enables you to contemplate this history, whatever it may be, this period of time, this formative period of time in your life, and evaluate it and reevaluate it. That is very absorbing and interesting. And that process also, I think people, it's easy to separate fact and fiction, say there's a big spread. I want to just tell the story of my family versus somebody who's writing a novel, say. But what I found out, realized when I was trying to sort of talk about my father for one thing, that was one subject, there's a lot of similarity because you do have to think, no matter if it is an actual family story of some kind, you're thinking about where to begin, what to include, what to leave out, and where to end. And those are exactly the same questions that the fiction writers got to answer too. And so they're very similar. And you also begin to feel the malleability of memory too. What your mind chooses to remember of all the things that it might have, and the pieces that are not there too. There's little skips. You didn't remember this for some reason. And that becomes, very interesting too. That's part of it.
Absolutely. There are two pieces I want to jump on there, if I may. I love this idea of storytelling, using your own stories as kind of a craft exercise. Larry, I love that, because you're right. When you're telling stories, it doesn't matter what kind of story it is, but there's always an entry point. There's always something that happens. There's always some sort of resolution. And as a storyteller, again, I work a lot in the fiction space. It's fun because oftentimes when people begin a novel or a short story, you want to start with a character who wakes up and has their feet slide off the bed and put their feet in their slippers, and then they walk and they get dressed. And can you tell how absolutely captivating or not this story is, right? But Larry, as you say, when you're telling a story, you tell it about what excites you, about what you remember. You don't necessarily start, it was a Monday and there was a sunny sky and he had orange juice with his toast. I mean, this is not exciting stuff, but when you actually have the story that you love, you're going to tell the best bits. And that's a great exercise. And the second piece, Larry, if I may jump on what you said, you and Angie both said something very similar that I think is fascinating. You were talking about storytelling and writing your own memories as kind of a self-awareness exercise, about understanding yourself better by recalling these moments of your lives. And Angie, you said something similar about how this is almost therapeutic sometimes when you write and tell these stories of your own. And I think that is so very true. Does anybody else have anything to add on that note of self-awareness or therapy or sympathizing with oneself? I love that.
Well,
I'll mention one thing about the therapeutic value. Once, it's probably been 30 years ago now, I had something bad happen in my life and I was with my mother and she was trying to make me feel better. So she starts telling me these family stories about people that owe you. That's nothing compared to this. And I can't even repeat them because I don't know who might be on this call that knows who. But there are a couple stories that I was like, oh my goodness, that I would never have dreamed them up, much less thought that they had actually occurred in my family. And you think about that, I have some things like that my sons would never know about. So everybody's got those stories, I think, if you figure out the way to get them out.
Right. And that perspective, you're right, is absolutely fascinating when you say, wait a second, I'm going through this moment, I am incredibly stressed. But you're right, there have been people close to you who have been through battles, and those battles might make everything that you're struggling with in that moment see it in a brand new light. That's good.
What I saw about it is I thought, wow, that's a cool story. My trauma's not that cool, but yours is.
Dolores, I think someone did put something in the chat. There was can you see that?
You mean what Terry said?
While Dolores is looking for the question, I have one myself. So we live in kind of a strange spot right now, and the circles between like personal space and political space have become smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where I think now they're non-existent. So I guess I have a twofold question, which is one, do you think you can do any writing, creative or otherwise, that is outside the political frame? And then two, if you can, is it worth doing or even maybe ethical to write outside of the context of political framework? And political not meaning like who's voting for who, but political as in like the big things that control our existence.
Right. It's been interesting as someone who spends a lot of time in the fiction world to watch how the past 12 months have shaped my clients' lives and my clients' thought processes, because through COVID, through the political atmosphere that we have been in, there have been so many people who have just creatively shut down. They just say, I am writing, but I can't step away from, what do they call it, doom scrolling, watching social media, news feeds. It's terrible. And then other people have been on this creative hyperdrive, whether it is a story that is a mission statement, a manifesto hiding inside of a thriller or whatever it happens to be. And then a lot of people, I feel like, have been just really diving into escapism. I've been seeing a lot of romance taking off this past year, not necessarily taking off on the shelves. Dolores could speak more to that piece, but in terms of people who have fiction that is just pouring out of them, there's been a lot of escapism that I would feel like, at least what I've seen, has been outdoing the statement pieces of let's talk about equality, let's talk about fairness. Those pieces have been there, but I've been seeing just so much escapism in romance and suspense and mysteries, and all of that has just been really an overdrive lately in my sphere. How about you all?
Well,
have you been able to write?
That's an awfully good question, and a big one too. I think I feel the presence of boundary lines, perhaps, and that there's certain things that you must tread carefully around, and so I think I feel kind of aware of that there's a new perspective on a lot of things, and you have to be, I guess, careful about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would add, I think there's some value in this time to escapism, that some people are going to need that. But, and as a writer myself, though, I think what Swade was kind of getting at is like the political is kind of hard to escape anyway. Even if you're writing science fiction or something, you're usually writing about like the time that you're in, and it's your brain processing and, figuring out things, at least mine, figuring out things that, what I think about what's going on around at the present moment. And I know for a part of the the beginning part of the pandemic, my brain was too stressed to actually be really creative, but then it kind of like eased off and I started working on new stuff. But is that what you were kind of getting at, Swade?
Yeah, that even, like you can call the Brave New World a sci-fi novel, but it's like inherently political, right? So the
Right,
question
yeah.
is, do we as writers, we like the royal we, have a right to like write fiction that isn't tackling these questions in way, shape, or is there still room for like Nicholas Sparks? Maybe is the question. And I've not read nearly enough Nicholas Sparks to know whether or not he's asking these important questions. So.
Yeah.
There's always room. There's always room. No matter what you write, there is always room. And I feel like no one should ever be intimidated to think that the story that they want to say in this moment or the message they need to spread in this moment is not relevant in this era of literature or this era of storytelling. Every single voice. And I think that's one thing that has been front and center also for me for the past 12 months, and especially since this book came out, is every single one of us has a voice. And no matter what your story is that you want to tell, no matter what genre you want to put into, no matter what that message ultimately is, let's respect the fact that we can all have our own perspectives and we can all share that perspectives. And maybe we should all respectfully listen to each other's perspectives. And I feel like that's an exercise for all of us, right?
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, you got to stick with what you're doing. If you're onto something there's so many cross currents and everything, you can't, I just find that this is what I'm doing and I'll do it as well as I am able. And I just have no idea how this is going to be received or if this is the right moment for it. And I just can't exhaust myself with those questions. I have to be committed to the book that I'm writing, committed to the character that I'm writing about, trying to write this character's story. I owe it to him since I started with it to complete it. And that's, I think, somewhere along the line, the writer, storyteller just makes that kind of commitment, I think, to the story, regardless of what anybody else may think of it.
And again, if we're talking about writing our stories down and preserving our family stories, I feel like writing down what we remember, what we were thinking about at whatever moment, what are the memories of our grandparents or parents, that even as that's the value of preserving them, right? Is even as things change and perspective change and attitudes change, having written down your thoughts, memories, experiences of a certain time captures them and allows the future to look back on them and learn from them.
Absolutely.
Right.
You have a certain perspective. I mean, there's no other aperture. That you have a particular aperture, and there's anybody else who's quite got that same aperture. And through that one aperture, you survey the whole world. All these stories that you have are coming, and there's nobody that can replicate that. And somehow and furthermore, I think that the stories that we write down, and you never know when these sorts of things may turn up and be of use to somebody else. Oh, well, it's just the family stories. Nobody's going to care about that. But who knows? The historian coming back through something that your grandmother said or did or was involved with will verify something else. If you're thinking in those terms, that the historian is looking for some verification. Here it is.
Mhm.
And these odd little things that seem so peculiar and of no interest to anybody else, but maybe you or a few friends or family members, you just don't know. You just don't know. And if they're gone, they're just gone.
I'm reading The Cooking Gene which is a book by Michael Twitty, in which he spends a decade delving into his family's history. He's a Black man, and he uses DNA testing to verify a lot of his family genealogy that's been lost over the years because of slave trading and moving within the US. But one thing, there's one whole chapter he talks about, it's my favorite part of the book, where he relays this story that was been passed on for generation to generation, probably 100 years. It had been passed down and passed down. And after all the DNA testing and the genealogy, and he hires a historian to go through public records, and it turns out that this story, which he had doubted ever since he'd heard it, turns out to be verifiable, and the science and the public record and all of it backs it up. And he was like, really? Like it. And so he comes out of the end of the chapter is, so basically all these people, slaves or sharecroppers or people who had really tough lives that were his ancestors, he's like, all these people had taken the time out of their crazy schedule, and their families had been broken apart, but at some point they had shared this story, and it had managed to be passed down, even despite all these sort of factors weighing against its being passed down. It had been passed down, and so of course it was true, right? Like that, just the very effort of sharing that story and passing it down from generation to generation should have given him more belief in it. So I really love that passing down our stories can be just so valuable to each of us.
Absolutely. And now I need to go pick up that book.
It's really good.
From Dolores.
Absolutely. We've got some coming in. I will put in a plug for Book City Roanoke and the Change Academy. They're reading The Cooking Gene.
Mhm.
The program starts on March 15th. There is some information on our website, so pop on over there. And apparently it's a very good book. I've got some on order. I haven't read it yet myself, but it's going to be a good discussion, I think.
And one last little note on family storytelling. One of the last sections in this book is a section not about specific memories, but about language and just kind of really big ideas. I won't necessarily say it's the philosophy section, but it's kind of the philosophy section on saying, first off, the very beginning of the book, we have, okay, write down the name of who's doing this book and the date which you were doing it. And then it becomes a little bit more interesting of what does the word success mean to you? What does the word happiness mean to you? What does the word fairness mean to you? Equality, family. There are all of these really big concepts that take a moment out of our insane lives to put into words. What does a successful life look like? And when you pause with questions like that, not only do you preserve it, or as Larry said, how cool would it be for someone 3 generations down to see how their great grandmother had a perspective on what a successful life was in 2021 or whatever the year happens to be. But also it's an exercise for self. Okay, what is my definition of a successful life? And okay, if that's my definition, what does that say about what I'm doing with myself? It's just a fascinating exercise. I know we're starting to wrap up here, but I just wanted to thank everybody for Angie, Christina, Larry, for being here with us and joining in the storytelling conversation, because I love this stuff. I geek out on this stuff, and it's just so nice to find like-minded souls who care passionately about these things. I have one final question for each of you, and I think this is a curveball I didn't even give you in advance. Why do you write? I'll give you a moment on that one. Angie, Christina, and Larry. Why do you write? Anyone?
Because I'm not very good at anything else.
I like that.
Fair answer. Well, you're good at writing, so that works.
I would say because I can't not write. If that makes sense, yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow, well, let's see. I guess I like to create worlds. I like to create a world, and I love to put characters in it and live in that verisimilitude existence, I suppose. That is, I love that. I love that. And it seems like loving something like that ought to be of value to somebody. So that's why I like to do that. And yeah.
Well, and Larry, I would define that as being successful. If you're doing something you love and you're good at it and you enjoy it, that's being successful. So.
Yeah, it's got to be good for the world, you think.
I hope.
You hope.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. For those interested, I'm dropping a link into the chat. I have a monthly newsletter where I share a lot of, whether it's storytelling prompts or English language trivia or communications tips or podcast links on etymology and all sorts of the place, but I'm dropping that link in the chat box. If anyone is interested in following along with the journey of language and storytelling and empowering yourself with the words that you use. So check it out, get in touch. I'd love to stay in contact.
Chris, I want to thank you and everybody for putting this together and making it so interesting. I know it just when we started talking about it made me start thinking differently about stories and family. And that piece I did on my grandmother, I hadn't pulled it out probably in 20 years and looked at it. And I pulled it out the other day and it was just, it almost read like a new story. And I'll throw in one we haven't really talked about is just that our memories don't always serve us well. I've kept a journal since I was in 8th grade, I think. And I was reading back over a time when my children were little, and I read this whole section about my youngest son planned family night for us. And he planned dinner and cooked dinner and picked out games for us to play. And I have no memory of that, but I wrote it down and I'm so glad now I did. So I think, just the process of doing it just for ourselves, regardless of what else happens with it. I'm going to put the link in the chat as well. This is to get to the page where if you're interested, you can purchase any of the books that they've mentioned tonight. If you are interested in the Roanoker for Christina's work, I'm not sure if she's in this month, but we do carry that if we can ever help you with that. And please feel free to shoot us any messages you have about these events or any others you'd like to see. And we carry everybody's book there. So just come and join us anytime.
Thank you, Dolores, and thank you, Chris, and thank you for everyone that took the time to be present for this.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.
And thanks for putting this together, Chris, and everybody.
Absolutely.
Bye,
Hey,
Angie.
and Dolores, they actually have changed the dates on the new Change Academy and pushed it back 1 week. So
Okay.
I didn't know if you were in the loop, but March 22nd is the new start date.
Okay, yeah, I did have the 15th, so I'll adjust that.
So have you
Thanks
been
a lot.
Have you been doing that, Christina?
I have, yeah.
Okay, cool. Which one did they read last time?
Cast by
Okay.
Isabel Wilkerson.
Because that's what the Virginia Western is reading right now. So
It's so good.
cool.
Yes, well, this has been really, really good, Darren. Oh, thanks for our tech guy.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks,
Wade.
Wade. He does a great job, and he
Yeah.
is an English major and always answers these really intelligent questions
Oh, no kidding, boy.
that just,
Yeah.
it's very
Gotta do it,
thoughtful and
gotta
way
do
bit
it.
over my head.
All right.
Thanks, folks.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.